Hello, this is Andy LaRouche. I am presenting for you Musicophilia, Tales of Music in the Brain by Dr. Oliver Sacks. This book is very interesting. I chose it because it specifically delves into the idea of our neurology and our physiology and how it relates to music in the brain. He also gives some really a great number of really interesting case studies that are specific from his practice. So let's talk about Oliver Sacks for just another second. So Dr. Sacks was a practicing physician. He actually just died recently in 2015. And he's a practicing physician, a best-selling author. He has several books, which we'll take a look at in just a second. He was a New York Times contributor along with the New Yorker and a professor of neurology at the New York University School of Medicine. The Oxford Companion to Music was his Arabian Nights as a child. This was interesting to read in the book. He basically says he read it like a storybook, and he kind of delighted in the personal tales. And he mentions also that he searches for relationships with music first in new texts. Wow, that was too difficult. About neuroscience. So he doesn't have a background in music that I could find as far as being an instrumentalist or a vocalist or anything. He just has a really keen interest in it, so much so that now his whole book is about it. Some of his other books, Awakenings, which is the story about his work at the Beth Abraham Hospital in the Bronx. This actually became the movie Awakenings, which was starring Robert Williams and Robert De Niro, if you saw it way back when. This was the one where they had patients in wheelchairs who were just kind of frozen, throwing balls back and forth, and this was kind of their awakening. He eventually treated these folks with L-Dopa, which kind of awakened them, and hence the title. The Man Who Mistook His Wife for a Hat is one of his many books where the format is basically he takes one example for the title, and through that example and many, many others, he explores different topics inside of the idea of neurology and kind of the idiosyncrasies and the interesting differences that we have in all these special cases. So in this case, Dr. P had visual agnosia, a neurological condition that leaves him unable to recognize even familiar faces and objects. So they just the idea of shapes and things like that don't process properly. Seeing Voices is investigating the world of deaf people in sign language, the island of the colorblind, covering a rare community of colorblind people. And then A Leg to Stand On is interesting. This is actually partially autobiographical, as all of his books are. It's an account of his recovery from an injury from an accident that left his leg severely injured. He completely tore a tendon, and he was disabled for quite some time. Actually, he references that story in Musicophilia, and he mentions the use of sort of this like rhythmic rowing idea because he was on the side of a snowy mountain, and it was kind of one of those things where he had to get down by nightfall, otherwise he might not survive. So he mentions being able to use this rowing motion to push him down the mountain while somehow taking his mind off the pain. And he got down. He published several books after that and had some really interesting, although challenging stories to tell from that experience. So in Musicophilia, like many of his books, he covers a wide range of topics. Of course, Musicophilia, the sudden onset or the congenital experience of kind of being a musicophile, just like an audiophile or things like that. Aphasia or disharmonia, the idea that our brain is not processing sound or harmonic function properly. Earworms, which we've already talked about. Savants, people who seem to have lower level skills in many other things, but they have one unique skill that is incredibly strong. Synesthesia, which he does not directly relate in this book with specific stories, although he kind of bumps into it. Music therapy for both aphasia and Parkinson's and other things. Tourette's, emotion and music, and really his writing style blends many subjects together. So even though you'll have a heading of a chapter that reads something like A Bolt from the Blue, Sudden Musicophilia, he does not necessarily confine himself to that space. If he does in the beginning, it's not always for very long. So the case studies that I chose to highlight that were interesting to me were some about earworms that were generally benign but sometimes maddening, which was not something we'd run into. Amusia and dysharmonia after neurological trauma. So although they can exist congenitally or they can just have an onset, these were the two case studies were after some sort of neurological trauma. One was an auto accident, and another a double stroke victim. And then perfect pitch, and here we offer extended examples and forms that we hadn't run into. Perfect pitch is something that's discussed a little bit, about a page and a half inside of the TAN text, but not quite as in depth, and it doesn't have as many case studies. So earworms, brainworms, sticky music, catchy tunes. These are all different terms I've run into in reading the book and also in Tan's text. And he starts his chapter off with a Carole King quote, "Music is playing inside my head over and over and over again, there is no end." In our text, we run into this quote from Halpert and Bartlett of 2011, estimating that as many as 72% of us experience some sort of earworm daily, with 64% of us finding the experience as either neutral or pleasant. I would estimate that if we were to somehow redo the study or mimic the study with just musicians, I would imagine that 72% would grow greatly. I don't know if there's a concert cycle I've been through that didn't include some sort of music getting stuck in my head every single day, multiple times. Most of the time, it's the stuff that's in the concert cycle. Specifically, Sachs refers to a friend, Nick Jonas, or Jones, who had the theme from Love and Marriage. The theme Love and Marriage from the TV show Married with Children stuck in his head for 10 days. During that time, Nick went from neutral feelings to desperately trying to get rid of this sort of hook he's had stuck in his head. And it began to affect his schoolwork, his peace of mind, his thinking, and his sleep. And then he tried some pretty interesting things to get rid of it. He jumped up and down, which I don't know that I would ever try, but I guess he was just desperate. He counted to 100, so trying to divert his mind. He splashed water on his face, again trying to divert his mind. He tried talking loudly to himself and plugging his ears. Plugging his ears is interesting because if the music is inside his head, how's he going to get rid of it by plugging his ears? I'm not quite sure. So Dr. Sachs experienced the phenomenon himself on several occasions, but he specifically mentioned one that was meaningful to him. He was raised an Orthodox Jew, and the song Had Gadya was sung after meals very frequently, and it's a song that repeats itself, kind of like 12 Days of Christmas or something like that, where the song builds and builds and builds and gets longer as you go. So he says eventually he counted how many times the melodic earworm would be sung to complete the song, and it was 46. So already that is some pretty heavy conditioning. So Tan and Sachs both agree that songs generally come from somewhere, and it'll be something like recent exposure or like a TV show, a religious song, or sometimes it's just a piece of music that's meaningful to you. In the case of Dr. Sachs's earworm, I would hypothesize that it's likely something like repetition priming, when repetition of similar or identical stimulus increases our perception of it. And that's from Tan et al. Another parallel I would draw is you don't see Honda Accord, but then you just start seeing them everywhere. Is that really that there are more Honda Accords, or is that repetition priming and now suddenly you're looking for it? Ten et al. Also points out that earworms may be tied to unconscious memory and learning through priming, that's mentioned above, the perception of stimulus making previous memories more easily accessible, and implicit memory, which influences how we perform tasks and is not generally accessible to the consciousness. Implicit memory also has been tied to unconscious identification of total schema and pitch chroma, and we talked about that in our chapter experiences as well. The idea that we have this body of information helping us identify and organize information as we perceive it to better understand it and process it. So also, 10 mentions Gestalt grouping principles later, and that the many demands of processing music and other stimulus may push the brain into this type of repetitive state, may be part of how we're processing one small chunk of the whole picture to better understand it and process it. Outside of your average person experiencing earworms are those who experience them in conjunction with other types of neurological illness. So Sachs goes into this a little bit in this chapter. It's actually one of the shorter chapters. And he mentions a Parkinson's disease patient who described herself as being somehow trapped or boxed in by repetitive musical thoughts while in these frozen states. And she gets pretty specific, the idea of being caught in a quadrangle shape, and she kind of is like bouncing off the wall over and over and over again, stuck in her frozen state. He also compares them to situations, other situations of neurological illness that are prone to tics or repetitive activity. So folks with autism will have certain triggers or certain activities or actions that they take several times. Tourette's can be facial tics, but also the more commonly recognized verbal tics, though it's not always with profanity like it tends to be portrayed. And then OCD, of course, related to cleanliness, but sometimes and frequently related to having to have things a specific way or do things a specific number of times before you can move on. And again, all of these can be triggered by repetitive thought or activity. So amusia and dysharmonia, amusia, a loss of melodic clarity or processing, and then disharmony is a loss of harmonic or textual processing. These conditions can be congenital or brought on by neurological trauma. The cases that I'm going to show are brought on by neurological trauma. Sometimes they're compared to, the amusia is sometimes compared to the rhythmic banging of pots and pans or using a hammer on a piece of sheet metal. Dr. Sachs himself experienced amusia as part of a migraine aura or halo that he had. And if you're not familiar with migraines, they're, of course, incredibly powerful headaches, but they can cause other neurological problems. My mom had migraines for years, and she found out that depending on the severity, she could actually go blind for a short time, and then as the migraine subsided, her vision would come back. And there's no proof that migraine causes swelling of the brain or anything like that. So that's actually one of the other things that Dr. Sachs studied from his own personal experience. He has a book about migraines. The examples in either source didn't get specific regarding the areas of the brain that were damaged, only that it was due to trauma. And that's difficult because it makes it extremely difficult to draw any type of conclusions. So in his book, Dr. Sachs talks about Rachel Y., who was an experienced musician that was in a traumatic car accident, leaving her in a coma for several days. She had both brain injury and spinal injury, and she was caught in a coma. And then when she came out of that, she had several days of the twilight state, and then which is the kind of the state between coma and awake. And there's a lot of study about the twilight state because you're really kind of there but not there. And he describes it as being under anesthesia, where your brain activity is similar to that of being in an awake state, but you're not really there. During her recovery, Rachel Y. Came to realize that her basic intelligence and language facilities had remained intact, but her relationship with processing music had fundamentally changed. So Rachel was a professional musician. She was a performer and she had previously had perfect pitch and performed music at a very high level. And while she could still discern different pitches, her ability to name them specifically had gone. So her perfect pitch was gone. And then additionally, her ability to process cohesive music concepts was changed in a perception of many contrapuntal voices. Now, these are her words, and as a musician, she would likely have a very accurate way of describing her experience. So this is the disharmonia we're talking about. She couldn't hear harmonies as one concept. It was like she was listening to Bach counterpoint all the time. In Tan, there are a similar story of GL, a Canadian man who was a non-musician who had an aneurysm on his right side of his brain and then another minor one on the left side of his brain. After these events, he was able to regain most of his language function, but the amusia remained. Specifically, Gio was unable to perceive melodies, even familiar ones, in the way he previously could. So this was actually something we did as part of our reading in our coursework. And this is interesting for me because the trauma affected both hemispheres. So the idea of one side processing language and one side processing music, he had traumatic brain injuries on both sides of his brain. Again, unfortunately, it's not very specific. It doesn't say any auditory cortex or any language processing center. It doesn't mention what lobe or anything like that, just that it happened. The two accounts align with our exploration of the brain and processing music and language. The brain processes information it receives from somewhat predictable regions, as I just mentioned. The right hemisphere is generally associated with music, with the left being associated with language. However, these are far from concrete rules, as we've learned when considering processing language and music as multifaceted tasks. So, of course, everything we hear goes through our auditory cortex, and then it kind of branches out from there, and our brain delves out information, and we process it as music or language, or sometimes both if it's a piece that has lyrics. So, again, incredibly complex processes going on in our brain. If we were to further analyze the damage caused in a person's brain after the trauma through EEG or MRI, we could perhaps gain some insight into the specific regions damaged and try to discover about the levels of dissociation between language and music processing. The case of GL is interesting, again, because of the trauma was on both sides. It's unfortunate, that we don't come out and get a brain scan before trauma. That's the difficulty in this field, is how many times do we go in and get an EEG or an MRI or an fMRI or some other brain imaging scan before there's a trauma. It always happens after. So we don't know if that area was already damaged and it just got further damaged or what have you. In these cases, if we had a before and after scan, it might be helpful in proving dissociations with different regions of the brain, because we could see what there was and then what was damaged. Otherwise, it's incredibly difficult. We just know what was damaged and kind of have to go from there. In the case of Rachel Y, Tan actually references Sachs's book as the back end of this chapter by saying that there might have been damage to the part of the brain that processes Gestalt wholes, going back into learning theory and the idea of chunking. So it's very interesting that Tan actually references Sachs and tries to offer a solution that he did not, which is the idea that memory was being processed differently, and that's perhaps why her disharmonia had come. So perfect pitch was something that we talked about as well, and the text clearly lays out our tendency for perfect pitch to occur in those exposed to Western music because of clear labeling systems of note names and clearly defined pitch, height, and chroma, along with octave equivalents. Sachs gives several examples that fall in line with the information. He even uses the word chroma, but he goes further into the idea when he starts describing his specific cases. He even bumps a little bit into synesthesia in the chapter when he's mentioning the feel or flavor of a specific note. He doesn't so much go to say as that it has a color or a texture, but it's in that vein. Sachs discovered, actually through reading the Oxford Companion to Music, a Finnish etymologist who had absolute pitch, but from my perspective, in an incredibly accurate way. Not only was he able to identify the pitch of the beating wings of an insect as an F sharp, but he was also able to associate it with 46 hertz, which is amazing because it's so low compared to our relative ability to perceive. So this was the first time I had discovered that, and he doesn't really go further, but it was an interesting twist because when we were studying it initially in the book, in the textbook, we did not run into the concept of having perfect pitch, naming the pitch in a Western sense, but then also assigning a frequency. So that was incredibly interesting. It was unique among the case studies we've seen. Sachs also mentions a friend and composer, Michael Tork, who, when he was visiting his house, was able to mention that Dr. Sachs's 19th century piano was tuned a third of a tone flat, so not a semitone, not a whole tone, a third of a tone flat, which again is like an interesting measurement. So we could perhaps take that back and say it was 33 cents flat or something like that. But again, the idea of not just saying it's this pitch, but using perfect pitch to demonstrate knowledge of where partial tones or something that's out of tune can sit in the relative schema of Western music. Sachs suggests, this is one of the few places where I disagree with Dr. Sachs. He suggests an overall sharpness or flatness could not be noticed by someone without perfect pitch. And I disagree. I think specifically musicians would recognize a piano that was tuned almost a half step flat. I think our ability to perceive pitch would be such that if someone played a middle C and it sounded more like a concert B, I feel like a musician at least would perceive that something was off. They may not be able to put their finger on it, but I think they would perceive that something is off, especially when taking into consideration our experiment from Lesson 5 when we're creating a song from memory, and we were able to do it within a semitone. So, and many of us were right on. So I strongly feel that if we run into a whole piano that was in tune with itself, but out of tune in the sense of being tuned at 440, I'm not necessarily sure that I agree we wouldn't perceive it. So conclusions. The book is incredibly dense. I chose 3 case studies. There were probably over 100. And as I said, they run into various places in the juxtaposition of information about neurology and information about music and music perception. The organization is such that topics tend to bump into each other. So as I mentioned before, it's not as clean cut as reading the Radice book or the Tan book, in that it's certainly scientific, but not to a very high degree. And it's lacking a little bit there for me because some of the definitions of non-musical terms or the inclusion of data regarding a case study would definitely further our understanding. There are several times where he uses a musical term and then he'll use a parenthetical insert to offer a kind of layperson's definition, but he tends to stay away from the from the non-musical terminology, the scientific terminology, a little bit more than I would have necessarily liked. He definitely encouraged me to study this more, and again, there were so many in the book. It was so many case studies in the book. It was very difficult to narrow everything down. So definitely a great read, though. Highly recommend it, and thank you very much.